The morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside like smoke from 1,000 campfires, but beneath its deceptive calm lay the promise of unimaginable carnage. June 3rd, 1864, would be remembered as one of the bloodiest days in American history, when 7,000 Union soldiers would fall in less than an hour at a place called Cold Harbor. Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood beside his command tent, studying the map spread across a makeshift table. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across his weathered face as he contemplated the Confederate lines just beyond the tree line. For 6 weeks, his Army of the Potomac had been locked in a deadly dance with General Robert Edward Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, moving ever southward toward Richmond through the wilderness of central Virginia. The crossroads settlement of Cold Harbor held no particular significance beyond its strategic location. Local residents had dubbed it Cold Harbor, not for any chill in the air, but for the tavern that provided shelter without the warmth of a hot meal. Now, this unremarkable intersection would become the focal point of Grant's relentless overland campaign. Colonel Horace Porter, Grant's aide-de-camp, approached with the latest intelligence reports. "General, our scouts confirmed that Lee has established strong defensive positions along the entire front. The earthworks appear substantial, with interlocking fields of fire." Porter's voice carried a note of concern that he tried to suppress. Grant took a long draw from his cigar, the ember glowing red in the pre-dawn darkness. He had been fighting Lee for over a month now, from the wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse, from the North Anna River to Totopotomoy Creek. Each time, Lee had managed to block his advance, but each time, Grant had refused to retreat as his predecessors had done. The newspapers back north had begun calling him Unconditional Surrender Grant, but they had no idea of the terrible weight of command that pressed upon his shoulders. Across the field, General Lee sat astride his horse traveler conducting his own reconnaissance of the Union positions. At 57, the Confederate commander had aged visibly during the campaign. His gray beard was streaked with white, and the lines around his eyes had deepened with each passing battle. Yet his tactical genius remained sharp as ever. He had anticipated Grant's move to Cold Harbor and had positioned his forces accordingly. The Confederate earthworks stretched in a curved line nearly 7 miles long, anchored by natural obstacles and reinforced throughout the night. Soldiers had worked tirelessly, using bayonets, tin cups, and bare hands to dig rifle pits and construct breastworks from logs and earth. The defensive position was formidable, creating what military engineers would later describe as an impregnable fortress. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps had arrived at Cold Harbor after a grueling forced march, their uniforms caked with dust and their faces etched with exhaustion. These veteran soldiers had survived the hell of Gettysburg and the horror of the wilderness. But something felt different about this morning. Many had taken to writing their names on scraps of paper and pinning them to their uniforms, a grim acknowledgement of what they expected to face. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, both armies prepared for what would become one of the most controversial decisions of the war. Grant, believing that Lee's forces were demoralized and vulnerable after their hasty retreat to Cold Harbor, had decided upon a frontal assault. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The silence of the Virginia morning was broken only by the distant sound of soldiers preparing their weapons and the occasional whicker of horses sensing the tension in the air. In a few hours, this peaceful countryside would be transformed into a killing field that would claim more lives in minutes than many battles claimed in days. History would record this as Grant's greatest tactical mistake, but in those quiet moments, before dawn, the full horror of what was to come remained mercifully hidden in the morning mist. The Confederate defenders crouched behind their earthworks as the first light of dawn revealed the magnitude of the Union force arrayed against them. Major General John Brown Gordon, commanding a division of Lee's 1st Corps, moved along the line offering words of encouragement to his men. The Georgia native had earned his reputation as one of the Confederacy's most capable field commanders, and his presence steadied the nervous soldiers. "Boys, we've got good ground and good cover," Gordon called out to his troops. "Let them come to us, and we'll send them back to where they came from." The soldiers responded with quiet confidence, checking their rifles and arranging their ammunition. Many had fought at Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness. They knew what was coming. According to historical accounts documented by the American Battlefield Trust, the Confederate defensive line at Cold Harbor represented some of the most sophisticated field fortifications of the entire war. The earthworks were not merely hastily dug trenches, but carefully engineered positions that maximized the defensive advantages of the terrain while creating deadly crossfire zones for any attacking force. On the Union side, the 3 corps designated for the assault were positioned along a front stretching several miles. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps held the left. Major General Horatio Gouverneur Wright's 6th Corps occupied the center, and Major General William Farrar Smith's 18th Corps anchored the right. Each corps commander had received similar orders: advance at dawn and carry the Confederate works by storm. Private Thomas Henderson of the 5th New Hampshire Infantry sat with his back against a oak tree, reading a letter from his wife for what he feared might be the last time. Around him, his comrades went through their own pre-battle rituals. Some cleaned their rifles with obsessive care, others wrote final letters home, and a few simply stared silently at the Confederate position visible through the morning haze. The tension was palpable as officers moved among their units, synchronizing watches and making final adjustments to the attack plan. Unlike the sophisticated bombardments that would precede later assaults, Grant had ordered minimal artillery preparation, believing that surprise would be more valuable than suppression fire. It was another miscalculation that would cost thousands of lives. Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., serving on the staff of the 6th Corps, later wrote about the eerie calm that preceded the battle. The future Supreme Court Justice described how the morning birds seemed to fall silent as if nature itself sensed the impending carnage. Even the horses appeared restless, pawing the ground and rolling their eyes as their riders made final preparations. Lee himself rode along the Confederate line one final time, his presence inspiring confidence in his men. The commanding general paused frequently to speak with officers and enlisted men alike, his calm demeanor masking the terrible responsibility he carried. He had positioned his army perfectly, but he knew that even the strongest defensive position required courage and discipline from the men who held it. Brigadier General Evander McIver Law's Alabama Brigade occupied a particularly crucial section of the Confederate line, where the terrain offered natural advantages that had been enhanced by human engineering. Law had positioned his sharpshooters in advanced rifle pits, ready to pick off Union officers as they led their men forward. Behind them, the main line bristled with rifle barrels protruding from carefully constructed firing positions. As the sun climbed higher, the morning mist began to dissipate, revealing the full scope of both armies. The Union forces numbered approximately 108,000 men, while Lee commanded roughly 62,000 Confederate soldiers. The numerical advantage seemed to favor Grant, but the defensive positions would prove to be the great equalizer. The final minutes before the assault ticked away with agonizing slowness. Regimental chaplains moved among the troops, offering prayers and last rites. Drummers and buglers checked their instruments, preparing to sound the advance that would send thousands of men charging toward almost certain death. The stage was set for one of the most devastating tactical disasters in American military history. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, the order to advance would be given, and the peaceful Virginia countryside would erupt into a maelstrom of violence that would forever change the lives of those who survived and claim the lives of thousands who would not see another sunset. The haunting notes of the battle cry of freedom drifted across the field as Union drummers beat the long roll signaling the advance. At exactly 4:30 in the morning on June 3, 1864, nearly 40,000 Union soldiers rose from their positions and began their march toward the Confederate earthworks. What followed would be remembered as one of the most catastrophic frontal assaults in military history. Colonel Nelson Appleton, Miles of the 61st New York Infantry, raised his sword high above his head and shouted the command that would echo across the battlefield. Forward march! His regiment, part of Hancock's 2nd Corps, stepped off in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming in the early morning sun. Miles, who would later become a famous Indian fighter and commanding general of the United States Army, watched his men advance with a mixture of pride and dread. The Confederate defenders waited in silence, their rifles trained on the approaching blue lines. Major General John Brown Gordon had given explicit orders. Hold your fire until they're close enough that you can see the whites of their eyes. The discipline required to wait, while thousands of enemy soldiers approached, took tremendous courage. But these veterans had learned to trust their commander's judgment. Private Samuel Wilkson Jr. of the New York Tribune, serving as a war correspondent, witnessed the advance from a position near the Union artillery. His dispatches, later published in newspapers across the North, captured the terrible beauty and horror of the moment. The morning sun caught the polished bayonets of 40,000 men as they moved forward in lines that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. It was magnificent, and it was madness. The first indication of trouble came when the Union advance began to lose its perfect formation. The rough terrain, dotted with stumps, fallen logs, and small ravines, disrupted the neat lines that had looked so impressive at the start. Companies began to separate. Regiments lost contact with their neighbors, and the coordinated assault began to fragment into isolated attacks. Captain Robert Gould Shaw of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the Union's colored regiments, led his men forward with characteristic courage. Shaw had already proven his mettle at Fort Wagner in South Carolina, and his soldiers followed him with unwavering devotion. As they approached the Confederate works, Shaw could see muzzle flashes beginning to flicker along the enemy line like deadly fireflies. The Confederate volcano erupted with devastating effect when the Union forces reached the predetermined range. Thousands of rifles fired simultaneously, creating a wall of lead that swept across the attacking formations. The sound was unlike anything the participants had ever experienced, a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood of the 4th United States Colored Troops, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, described the Confederate defensive fire as a sheet of flame that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The carefully constructed earthworks channeled the attacking forces into kill zones, where converging fields of fire created carnage on an unprecedented scale. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, the superb corps commander known as Hancock the Eye, superb, watched his formations disintegrate under the withering Confederate fire. Regiments that had marched forward with 800 men were reduced to scattered groups of survivors in a matter of minutes. The Second Corps, which had played such a crucial role at Gettysburg, was being systematically destroyed. The 18th Corps, commanded by Major General William Farrar Smith, fared no better on the Union right. Smith's men, many of whom were recent recruits with limited combat experience, broke under the intensity of the Confederate fire. Entire companies simply vanished, their members either killed, wounded, or driven to seek cover in shell holes and behind fallen logs. In the center, Major General Horatio Gouverneur Wright's 6th Corps pressed forward with grim determination. Wright himself rode forward with his men. His horse shot out from under him twice during the advance. The Connecticut native rallied his troops repeatedly, but even his legendary courage could not overcome the mathematical certainty of the Confederate defensive advantage. The most horrific aspect of the assault was its brevity. Military historians later determined that the majority of Union casualties occurred within the first 10 minutes of fighting. The main part of the Battle of Cold Harbor was a frontal assault on Confederate lines that ended in nearly 7,000 Union casualties after less than an hour. By some accounts, most were lost in as little as 10 minutes. The Confederate earthworks had been transformed into a killing machine of unprecedented efficiency. As the morning wore on, the survivors of the initial assault found themselves pinned down in front of the Confederate lines, unable to advance or retreat. The Virginia sun beat down mercilessly on the wounded and dying, while Confederate sharpshooters picked off anyone who showed movement. The battle had become a siege, with thousands of Union soldiers trapped in no man's land, waiting for darkness to bring the possibility of escape or death to end their suffering. The morning sun climbed higher, transforming the battlefield into a furnace of death where wounded men cried for water that would never come. Between the opposing lines lay a killing field littered with the bodies of Union soldiers who had fallen in the first disastrous minutes of the assault. Those who survived the initial charge found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. Major General John Sedgwick's former staff officer, Captain Charles Francis Adams, Jr., crawled through the grass trying to reach wounded members of his unit. Adams, descendant of 2 American presidents, later wrote in his memoirs that Cold Harbor represented the most complete and devastating tactical defeat in the history of American arms. The privileged Bostonian had seen combat before, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic slaughter he witnessed that morning. Confederate soldiers in the earthworks watched the aftermath of their defensive triumph with a mixture of satisfaction and horror. Private Carlton McCarthy of the Richmond Howitzers noted in his diary that the field before their position looked like a blue carpet made of Union uniforms. Yet even these hardened veterans were sobered by the scale of destruction they had inflicted. The Union High Command struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before their eyes. General Grant, who had built his reputation on aggressive tactics and relentless pressure, found himself facing a tactical situation that defied conventional military wisdom. His chief of staff, Brigadier General John Aaron Rawlins, approached, with casualty reports that seemed almost impossible to believe. "Sir, preliminary reports indicate we've suffered over 7,000 casualties in the first hour alone," Rawlins reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Grant's expression remained stoic, but those who knew him well could see the weight of command settling more heavily on his shoulders. He had ordered men to their deaths before, but never on such a scale, and with so little to show for the sacrifice. Colonel Emory Upton, one of the Union's most innovative tactical theorists, had predicted that frontal assaults against prepared positions would prove suicidal in the age of rifled muskets and improved artillery. His warnings had been largely ignored by the High Command, but Cold Harbor was proving his theories with devastating clarity. The mathematics of combat had shifted decisively in favor of the defender. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's medical director, worked frantically to organize aid for the wounded who could be reached. The scale of casualties overwhelmed. The medical corps and many wounded soldiers bled to death within sight of help. Letterman's revolutionary ambulance system, which had saved thousands of lives at previous battles, proved inadequate for the concentrated carnage of Cold Harbor. Confederate sharpshooters, positioned in advanced rifle pits, maintained a deadly fire on any Union movement. Sergeant Randolph Harrison Fairfax of the 42nd Virginia Infantry achieved legendary status among his comrades by picking off Union officers with mechanical precision. His accurate shooting helped suppress any attempts to organize a second assault or rescue the wounded. The psychological impact of the disaster began to manifest itself throughout the Union ranks. Regiments that had fought with distinction at Gettysburg and the Wilderness showed signs of demoralization that worried their officers. Men who had followed orders without question began to express doubt about their leadership's competence. The social contract between officers and enlisted men was beginning to fray under the stress of seemingly pointless casualties. Major General Gouverneur Kemble Warren, commanding the 5th Corps, had been held in reserve during the initial assault. Warren, a former engineer who understood the technical aspects of defensive positions, urged Grant to abandon the attack and seek an alternative approach. His professional assessment was that the Confederate position was simply too strong to be taken by direct assault. The Confederate High Command, observing the Union predicament from their positions, began to consider whether a counterattack might destroy Grant's army entirely. General Lee conferred with his corps commanders, including Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell and Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell Hill, about the possibility of exploiting the Union disorder. However, Lee's innate caution and respect for Grant's abilities led him to maintain his defensive posture. As the afternoon progressed, attempts to renew the assault proved futile. Fresh Union regiments sent forward met the same fate as their predecessors, adding to the growing carpet of casualties between the lines. The Confederate earthworks had become an impregnable barrier that no amount of courage or determination could breach. The strategic situation began to clarify as both commanders assessed their options. Grant faced the worst tactical defeat of his career, with thousands of his best soldiers either dead or wounded for no territorial gain whatsoever. Lee had achieved a defensive masterpiece, but his army remained too weak to exploit the victory offensively. Cold Harbor was becoming a stalemate purchased with Union blood. The merciless Virginia sun beat down upon the killing field between the lines, where hundreds of wounded Union soldiers lay exposed to Confederate sharpshooters and the approaching agony of dehydration. The space between the opposing armies, no more than 200 yards at its widest point, had become a purgatory where the living envied the dead and hope drained away like blood into the sandy soil. Private Michael O'Sullivan, of the 28th Massachusetts Infantry, lay behind a fallen log, a Confederate bullet lodged in his shoulder. The Irish immigrant had survived the potato famine only to find himself dying slowly under the American sun. Around him, the moans and cries of wounded comrades created a symphony of suffering that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., serving on the staff of Major General Horatio Wright, attempted to organize rescue missions for the wounded trapped in no man's land. Holmes, who would later serve on the Supreme Court for 30 years, was learning lessons about the limits of human endurance that would shape his judicial philosophy. Each attempt to reach the wounded resulted in additional casualties as Confederate marksmen maintained their deadly vigil. The Confederate defenders faced their own moral crisis as they watched Union soldiers suffer and die within rifle range. Brigadier General William Mahone of Virginia's 3rd Corps later wrote that his men were moved to pity by the cries of the wounded Yankees, but duty required us to fire upon any who attempted rescue. The code of honor that governed 19th century warfare was being tested by the unprecedented nature of the tactical situation. General Grant, realizing that continued frontal assaults would only add to the casualty lists, ordered his subordinates to cease offensive operations and begin entrenching their positions. The admission of tactical defeat came hard to a commander who had built his reputation on aggressive action, but even Grant's determination had limits when confronted with mathematical impossibility. Major General George Gordon Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac under Grant's overall direction, supervised the construction of Union defensive works designed to protect against potential Confederate counterattacks. Meade, the victor of Gettysburg, understood the defensive advantages that Lee's army had exploited so effectively and sought to deny the Confederates similar opportunities. The logistical challenges of maintaining armies in close proximity without active combat created unique problems for both sides. Water sources were limited, sanitation became a critical issue, and the psychological strain of constant vigilance began to affect both Union and Confederate soldiers. The proximity of death, visible in no man's land, served as a constant reminder of mortality. Confederate engineer officers, including Colonel Walter Husted Stevens, worked to strengthen their defensive positions even further. Stevens, a former United States Army officer who had designed fortifications on the West Coast before the war, understood that the tactical advantage enjoyed by the defense could be maintained indefinitely with proper engineering. The Cold Harbor line became a textbook example of field fortification. Union artillery, under the direction of Brigadier General Henry Jackson Hunt, attempted to suppress Confederate positions through concentrated bombardment. Hunt, who had orchestrated the devastating artillery barrages at Gettysburg, found his guns less effective against the well-constructed earthworks at Cold Harbor. The Confederate engineers had learned from earlier battles and had designed positions that could withstand heavy artillery fire. The medical corps on both sides struggled with casualties on a scale that overwhelmed existing procedures. Union surgeon Dexter Clapp of the 21st Massachusetts Infantry worked continuously for 18 hours treating wounded soldiers, many of whom died from infections that would have been preventable with adequate medical supplies. The primitive state of battlefield medicine in 1864 meant that many men who survived their initial wounds would die from complications in the days that followed. Communication between the opposing armies became necessary to address the humanitarian crisis developing in no man's land. Informal truces, initiated by junior officers and gradually accepted by higher command, allowed for limited exchanges of wounded prisoners and the burial of the dead. These temporary ceasefires provided brief respites from the constant tension, but could not resolve the fundamental tactical stalemate. The psychological impact of Cold Harbor began to extend beyond the immediate participants to the civilian populations of both North and South. Northern newspapers, initially supportive of Grant's aggressive strategy, began to question the human cost of the overland campaign. Southern morale, boosted by Lee's defensive success, was tempered by the knowledge that the Confederacy lacked the resources for a prolonged defensive war. As evening approached on June 3rd, both armies settled into positions that would remain, largely unchanged for the next 9 days. The Battle of Cold Harbor had evolved from a tactical assault into a strategic siege, with thousands of lives lost for gains that could be measured in yards rather than miles. 9 days of stalemate stretched before both armies like an eternity of suffering, as the tactical disaster of June 3rd gave way to the grinding agony of siege warfare. The Confederate earthworks at Cold Harbor had proven impregnable, transforming Grant's war of movement into a static confrontation that foreshadowed the trench warfare of future conflicts. In the darkness between the lines, the wounded continued to die, their cries growing weaker with each passing hour. Major General Ambrose Everett Burnside, commanding the 9th Corps, arrived at Cold Harbor with reinforcements that brought the Union strength to over 100,000 men. Burnside, whose previous commands at Fredericksburg and the Crater had ended in tactical disasters, understood the futility of further frontal assaults against Lee's position. The former railroad executive had learned hard lessons about the relationship between terrain, tactics, and technology. The humanitarian crisis in no man's land finally forced both commanders to negotiate a formal truce for the removal of wounded and dead. On June 7th, after 4 days of bureaucratic delay and continued suffering, a brief ceasefire allowed Union burial parties to venture into the killing field. What they found there would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Colonel Ely Samuel Parker, a Seneca Indian serving as Grant's military secretary, supervised the grim task of casualty accounting. Parker, who would later help draft the surrender terms at Appomattox Courthouse, recorded Union losses that staggered even veteran soldiers accustomed to the arithmetic of death. The official tally would eventually reach 13,000 Union casualties against fewer than 2,500 Confederate losses. General Lee, observing the Union burial parties from his command post, reportedly commented to his staff that he had never seen such devotion to duty under such terrible circumstances. The Confederate commander, despite his tactical triumph, took no pleasure in the human cost of victory. Lee's correspondence with his wife during this period reveals a man increasingly burdened by the weight of command and the approaching exhaustion of Confederate resources. The strategic implications of Cold Harbor began to clarify as both armies assessed their positions. Grant's overland campaign had cost the Union Army nearly 60,000 casualties in 6 weeks of fighting, losses that even the North's superior manpower could not sustain indefinitely. The political ramifications were immediate and severe, with Northern newspapers and politicians beginning to question Grant's fitness for command. Confederate morale, while boosted by the defensive victory, was tempered by the recognition that such triumphs could not win the war. Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, Lee's chief of artillery, noted in his memoirs that Cold Harbor demonstrated the Confederacy's ability to inflict heavy casualties on Union forces, but also highlighted the impossibility of achieving decisive offensive victories with their limited resources. The tactical lessons of Cold Harbor would influence military thinking for generations to come. The combination of rifled muskets, improved artillery, and field fortifications had shifted the advantage decisively to the defender, making frontal assaults against prepared positions virtually suicidal. European military observers, present with both armies, would carry these lessons back to their own nations, influencing the development of tactics that would later be employed in the World War. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, one of the few female physicians serving with the Union Army, worked tirelessly to treat wounded soldiers during the siege. Walker, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for her service, witnessed firsthand the inadequacy of military medical systems when confronted with mass casualties. Her reports to the War Department led to improvements in battlefield medicine that saved thousands of lives in subsequent campaigns. On June 12, 1864, Grant finally acknowledged the futility of further attacks against the Cold Harbor position. In one of the most difficult decisions of his military career, he ordered the Army of the Potomac to disengage and begin another flanking movement toward the James River. The withdrawal was conducted under cover of darkness, ending the Battle of Cold Harbor after 12 days of stalemate. The aftermath of Cold Harbor would reverberate through both armies for the remainder of the war. Union morale, previously sustained by Grant's reputation for victory, suffered a blow from which it would take months to recover. Confederate confidence, while elevated by their defensive success, was undermined by the recognition that they lacked the strength to exploit such victories offensively. Grant himself would later write in his memoirs that Cold Harbor was the only battle I ever fought that I would not fight over again under the circumstances. The admission of error from a commander, known for his determination, demonstrated the profound impact of the tactical disaster on his thinking. Yet Grant's ability to learn from his mistakes would ultimately contribute to his success in the final year of the war. The Battle of Cold Harbor stands as a testament to the courage of soldiers on both sides and the tragic consequences of tactical miscalculation in an age of rapidly evolving military technology. The 7,000 Union casualties suffered in less than an hour on June 3, 1864, represent one of the most concentrated episodes of carnage in American military history. The lessons learned in the Virginia countryside would influence military thinking for generations, serving as a grim reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of adapting tactics to technological reality. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, as both armies moved toward their next confrontation, the fields of Cold Harbor returned to their agricultural purpose, but the memory of those terrible 12 days would endure, carved into the landscape of American memory alongside Gettysburg, Antietam, and the other great battles of the Civil War. The crossroads that had witnessed such carnage would be remembered, not for its strategic importance, but for the courage and sacrifice of the men who fought and died there in the service of their respective causes.